So if you haven't heard by now, deep sea explorers may have found Amelia Earhart's long-lost plane. According to her final radio messages with the U.S. Coast Guard vessel stationed nearby, all contact with Earhart ceased on July 2nd after 8:43 a.m. And that is supposedly the last anyone has ever heard from her. Until the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, or TGAR, published a paper in 2018 that strongly refutes this, stating that they have ample evidence to show that Earhart sent out radio distress messages for several days after July 2nd. After Earhart disappeared, the U.S. Navy put out an all ships, all stations bulletin. Authorities asked anyone with a radio and a trained ear to tune in to the radio frequencies that Earhart was using on her trip. And this was not as simple as it sounds. So the people who heard Earhart's distress messages just happened to be listening to the radio at the right time. And one of those people was a 15-year-old girl listening in from St. Petersburg, Florida, who transcribed some of the desperate phrases she heard. Quote, "Water's high, water's knee deep. Let me out. Help us quick." A housewife in Toronto heard a shorter message. Quote, "We have taken in water. We can't hold on much longer." On July 3rd, a woman named Nina Paxton from Ashland, Kentucky, said she heard Earhart say, quote, "KHAQQ calling," and that she was on or near a little island at a point near, and then it cuts out. Then she says something about a storm and that the wind was blowing. "We will have to get out of here. We can't stay here long." What happened to Amelia Earhart after that has vexed the world for nearly 87 years. TGAR is just one group of researchers who have dedicated their time and resources to solving one of aviation's greatest mysteries. So here's what they discovered. So they conducted an extensive analysis of more than 2,000 Coast Guard and U.S. Navy log entries and tracked down 57 credible post-loss radio messages reported in the days after Earhart's disappearance to construct a picture of what may have happened in those final days. Based on the quality of the radio messages, TGAR deduced that the point of origin of these radio messages were coming from Gardner Island, because the quality of radio reception decreased the farther you moved away from Gardner Island. And only at Baker Island, which is the station closest to Gardner, did an operator hear a strong, clear voice signal with the plane's call sign, KHAQQ. And if you notice, the island just above Baker is Howland Island. That is the island that Earhart and Noonan were supposed to land at to refuel and never arrived. And eerily enough, Earhart's very last radio message to the U.S. Coast Guard vessel at 8:43 a.m. was her stating that she was on the line, position 157-337, running north and south. And what island happens to be on this line of position? It's Nukumaro Island, also known as Gardner Island. So TGAR deduced that Earhart and Noonan had to basically crash land on Gardner Island and were marooned on the reef. And the reason TGAR believed this is absolutely bonkers nutso science. I mean that in a good way. Okay, if the plane was stuck on the reef at Gardner Island, then that presented Earhart with a problem. The plane's radio relied on the aircraft's batteries, but you need the batteries to start the engine. So if they kept the radio on and continued to send distress messages, then they would run out of the battery and they wouldn't be able to start the plane. But here's the rub. The timing of the distress messages are strange. TGAR believed that there was a pattern to them that was oddly specific, as if Earhart was only sending distress messages when the tide was out. So TGAR hypothesized that the plane was halfway underwater, and thus Earhart could only send messages when the water level was low enough for the propeller tip to clear. Because again, she needed to turn the engine on to send the radio message. In other words, TGAR concluded that Earhart and Noonan had to stick to a certain schedule based on the tide. They're seeking shelter, shade, and food during the day, and then they head back to the plane during low tide to try the radio message again. To test their hypothesis, TGAR compared past tidal levels and reef height data from Gardner Reef to the post-loss signals on an hour-by-hour timeline. And in their words, the correlation was astounding. Every credible transmission only occurred when the water level was low enough for the propeller to clear. But there's even more to this story. TGAR didn't just randomly start this investigation based solely on the post-lost radio messages. In 1940, bones were discovered on Gardner Island, which was originally believed to have belonged to Earhart, but then were, quote, misidentified and discarded. So TGAR built this body of evidence on top of forensic anthropologist Dr. Richard Yancey's paper in 2018, which reanalyzed the bone evidence using modern-day techniques. These bones on Gardner Island were found by a British expedition team who stumbled upon a skull, other skeletal parts, and the remains of what looked like a woman's shoe. Among these bones was a box that held a Brandis Navy surveying sextant made in 1918 and a bottle of Benedictine, an herbal liqueur. I wanted to do a little bit of digging to see if Benedictine was even popular in the 1930s when Earhart was alive. And I found out that Benedictine was one of the most popular cocktails in 1930s New York during the Prohibition. And Amelia Earhart lived in New York for a while. She went to Columbia University, and then after graduating, she continued to live there for a few years because her husband owned a publishing company there. So it's totally possible that she packed the Benedictine as part of her belongings for the flight. Anyways, the 13 bones were shipped to Fiji and were studied by D.W. Hoodless, who determined that the skeleton was a man and the bones were subsequently chucked. But since the bones are gone, Yance co-developed a computer program that can estimate sex and ancestry by using skeletal measurements, called Fordisk. Yance compared the lengths of the bones to Earhart's measurements, using her height, weight, body build, limb lengths, and proportions from both photographs and information found on her pilot's and driver's licenses. The Fordisk analysis not only found the bones were female, that Earhart's bones were, quote, more similar to the Gardner bones than 99% of individuals in a large reference sample. So in his paper, Dr. Yance says that the only documented person to whom these Gardner bones could belong to is Amelia Earhart. Although doing a proper DNA analysis on the actual bones would give us the clearest and most definitive answer, the Fordisk analysis comes pretty darn close. This, coupled with the Teagar's radio message analysis, paints a pretty compelling yet distressing picture. One can only imagine what was going through her mind in those final moments.